So in other words, instead of being bordered by great powers, Germany actually was the great power, bordered by struggling, emerging new nations. And as we'll see over the next couple of weeks, the Germans were able to take advantage of this, both militarily and economically, in the 1920s and 30s. And on Tuesday, we're going to talk about Weimar Republic and the rise of Nazism. But the perception that Germany was surrounded by enemies and was mistreated out of its proper place was quite strong. It's important to know, though, that this perception wasn't strong only among radical right wings in Germany, but was also quite widespread throughout the population as a whole. And it was compounded by lies told to them by the government, by the press, most of all by manipulation, by the military leaders who sort of slid out from the responsibility of the destructiveness of the war by promoting the idea of a so-called stab in the back. And here I should sort of highlight, it's important to remember that it was the German military leadership, Ludendorff and Hindenburg, who'd insisted that Germany could not fight on any longer. So it was the two military leaders who had urged the armistice. The Kaiser fled, and this meant it was the new German Republic that was created on November 9, 1918, that was left holding the bag for the consequences of the peace arrangements. The German military coined the term stab in the back to argue that Germany hadn't been defeated on the battlefront, but rather had been defeated by the collapse of the home front, by cowards at home who'd refused to fight on, had refused to continue to make sacrifices. And this poisoned the success, or the possibility of success, of the Weimar Republic. It also gave an alternative storyline to veterans who said they weren't defeated at the front but betrayed at home. We'll talk about a group a little bit later on in the lecture called the Freikorps. There was also a sense of opportunism by politicians in Germany who realized that they could say that Germany was betrayed, but that they would be the ones to redeem it by rolling up their sleeves and making the most of the situation and trying to improve it. So it's important to think about the experiment of democracy in Germany alongside this tainted atmosphere. This will help us to understand a little bit what took place during the Weimar Republic and why, in the end, it collapsed. The idea of shame and defeat, could argue, is perhaps, or was perhaps, exacerbated by the old social Darwinist notions that loaded defeat with the implication of inferiority. So you could almost say that the racist nationalists were trapped in their own ideology. So shame was part of this defeat. We see this clearly with the issue of the Rhineland. We know with the Treaty of Versailles that the German military was restricted to 100,000 men. Germany had no air force and a restricted navy. The region of the Rhineland was to be demilitarized and occupied for a period by the French. Now the French used colonial soldiers for this occupation, among others, men from Senegal. From Germans, who were already hostile to the peace settlement, this presence of these, quote, men of color on German soil was sort of a physical reminder of what they deemed the humiliation of Germany. There was active propaganda during this time, which accused the French colonial soldiers of plundering and of wild sexual fantasies, stories, not facts, of rape and miscegenation. Interestingly, the Germans found a sympathetic ear among the Allies, in particular, the United States. Americans were sympathetic to this fear of blacks having control over whites, or seemingly having control over whites. The notion of, or the total nature of the war also had important legacies for post-war innovations. The German capital of Berlin the Austrian-Hungarian capital of Vienna, there were large food riots. And this notion of food riots was another kind of political mobilization, because women actually influenced wartime decisions. They were able to secure basic foodstuffs for their family. So after the war, people's expectations actually grew that governments would provide for them. There was a certain pressure, I guess you could call it, on the post-war governments of all kinds to be more attentive to the needs of the people and the desires of their population. This was particularly important given the fear of revolution. So politicians in the post-war had to pay much, much closer attention to popular opinion. Not only were there increased expectations that states should provide some kind of welfare, but also because of the number of war dead, so that there's the expectations and also practical needs for states to develop a stronger welfare state. There were a lot of widows, orphans, and veterans, and people who expected the state to look after them or to provide for them. Indeed, states responded in various ways, but they opened up political participation. So the growth of the state wasn't just about the growth of state repression, for example, as we saw in Russia and in Italy, but also about the growth of state services. Democratization was embedded in post-war settlements. The new states had to have a parliament in order for populations to have a say. So there was the introduction of democratic practices where in countries or in areas where these practices had been non-existent or incomplete. And in places where there had already been traditional democratic practices, these were expanded in the wake of the war. For example, in Britain. In Britain, in 1918, the votes for women over 30 was given, or women over 30 were given the votes, so there was suffrage. In the new German Republic, the Constitution, the Weimar Constitution, allowed for universal adult suffrage. Even, actually, in the short-lived Russian provisional government of 1917, votes for women had been introduced. There was this idea and this expectation that women's participation needed to be included. There were also concrete results in Austria, for instance, and the Social Democratic Party of Austria played an important role in this. The party became particularly influential in Vienna. After the war, it created the city government in Vienna. Vienna actually became known as Red Vienna. The Social Democrats introduced a series of social welfare measures, important social welfare measures to benefit workers, things that we just sort of take for granted today, unemployment measures, 8-hour workday. They also, importantly, undertook the massive, massive building projects of flats for workers and for families. And these buildings were supposed to capture the most modern, sort of progressive kind of living. There were supposed to be healthy conditions, enough space, kindergartens, laundry. And here you see that correlation between artistic innovation, so architecture, and political innovation, providing for a state's inhabitants. In addition, I guess you could say, in addition to the radical political experimentation we saw in Italy, we saw in Russia, there were also these more moderate centrist reforms. And Austria is a good example of that. However, with any experiment, there are unforeseen circumstances. The reorganization of Europe into nation-states and minority treaties actually ended up making nationality a sort of problem, or the nationality problem, and made it more acute, I guess you could say. There are a number of examples we can look at in the 1920s, but I think we'll talk about Czechoslovakia because here the minority rights treaty didn't satisfy really anyone. Czechoslovakia became a stable parliamentary democracy, and it actually endured until the late 1930s. It was ultimately crushed by Nazi Germany. In the western part of the state was an area called the Sudetenland. There were many German speakers, Sudeten Germans. The Entente powers decided against German calls for this area to join either Germany or Austria because the mountains of this area would provide a natural defensive border for Czechoslovakia. In addition, this region was very, very important economically to the rest of the territory, so it was tied economically. It was also part of the historic boundary of the Bohemian crown. So the Sudeten people had to remain or remained a part of Czechoslovakia. These Sudeten Germans, which made up about 25% of the Czechoslovak population, objected to the idea of being relegated to minority status. And these concerns were stirred up by outside forces advocating for border changes, particularly Germany, in a process called irredentism. So an idea that borders should change, wanting to revise borders. For the Czechoslovakian government, this population of Germans was an ongoing source of instability. This area, along with Germany, produced a stream of complaints and provocations and shenanigans, I guess for lack of a better word, to draw attention about so-called violations of their rights. And they were supported by Germans and the German government, who in turn saw this situation as a way to destabilize Czechoslovakia. Also, the Slovak population in the eastern half felt subordinate to the Czechs. Similar things took place elsewhere. In the Treaty of Trianon, which was handed to Germany in June 1920, Hungary lost 2/3 of its territory, actually 60% of its total population, 25% of ethnic Hungarians. Romania actually received more Hungarian territory than Hungary actually had left. So at this stage, 1/3 of the Romanian population now consisted of Hungarians, Germans, Ukrainians, and it meant that 3.4 million Hungarians were actually living outside of Hungary. The contemporary Hungarian slogan in response to the treaty was, quote, "No, no, never." So irredentism was a huge part of Hungarian political life between the wars. There are also Ukrainians in Poland, Germans in Western Poland, and governments saw claims as a political tool, or used these claims as a political tool to gain popularity with their domestic populations. So basically, it sort of paid for governments to keep these borders in question. The treaties represented a new way of thinking about individual and collective rights, but they also provided a new set of institutions for protesting and stirring up trouble and calling into question these new borders. However, it wasn't just border changes that were implemented at the end of the war. There were also population transfers. The 1923 Treaty of Lausanne was the final treaty of the post-World War I period, or peacemaking process, and it finished off the division of the Ottoman Empire into new nation states and dealt with minorities of this group. It sanctioned mass population exchanges between Turkey and Greece in order to homogenize both states. They wanted to stop any atrocities from being carried out against Muslims, Turkish Muslims in Greek territory, and Greek Orthodox in Turkish territory. So it was thought that these population exchanges would sort of stabilize relations between Greece and Turkey. In fact, it led to more violence as people were forcibly expelled from their homes. And it actually really set a terrible precedent, because this treaty approved the, quote, most radical solution to the so-called nationality problem, the forced and violent, sometimes violent, movement of populations to create homogeneous states. We'll see this again during and after World War II. Even among the defeated nations, however, some were able to seize the possibility for renewal. Turkey was one of the countries that, I guess you could say, lost the most, suffered the most in the post-war period. The initial post-war treaty for Turkey was the harshest of them all. Turkey was actually the rump state of Turkey was very, very small. Turkey had actually suffered massive millions of casualties during the war. And the Turks ended up having to fight for the independence of Turkey itself. Because unlike Germany, in Turkey, there were occupation forces after the war. However, the Turks did fight for their independence, and the Republic of Turkey was founded. But there was still the legacy of the Armenian genocide and severe economic and social challenges, so it was a very dire situation. Nevertheless, under the leadership of Mustafa Kemal, known as Ataturk, he was the first president of the Turkish Republic. Turkey embarked on a period or a process of rebuilding that was quite transformational. They birthed a secular state, reformed the political system entirely, introduced new educational, legal, social, and political measures. So they tried to create a modern economy. Even the stigma of defeat, the loss of an empire, could be an opportunity to create something different. That doesn't necessarily mean that it was something positive or that it was something that worked out for everyone, but it was something new. And the example of Turkey is important because it shows that the refusal to accept defeat, as the Germans did, was not the only possible reaction to the end of the war and to the post-war peace settlements. By the 1930s, the relations between Turkey and Greece had become somewhat normalized. So the devastation of the war had opened up some possibilities for some surprising innovations. The republic that Ataturk presided over was one that tried to create space between the Muslim religion and the law. Actually, his own daughter became an airplane pilot. She was the first woman fighter pilot of Turkey, which is a bit of a departure from tradition. In Hungary, Bela Kun was able to establish a Soviet-style republic that lasted from March to June 1919, and that was briefly but then crushed, quite brutally crushed by forces on the right. And the forces on the right were supported by the Allies because the idea of a sort of a Budapest or a Soviet-style government in Budapest was unacceptable. Symbolized the westward expansion of Bolshevism. So this clash between revolution on the left and then crushing on the right left a bitter legacy of polarization in Hungary. The same thing happened in Germany. Forces on the right were used to end the possibility of a full German revolution. In Germany, the Communist Party was founded in 1919 after the revolution, in opposition to the policies and the actions of the Social Democrats and the Liberals. Because the hardcore communists believed that they'd been sold out through compromises. The Freikorps, which were groups of demobilized veterans who refused to disarm in Germany and felt betrayed, fought viciously against workers, communists in Munich and Berlin, and also against Poles in the borderlands. So radicalization on the left fueled radicalization on the right, and vice versa. The fear of revolution could be a very powerful weapon. And there were a lot of atrocities during this time period in Germany. Finally, I just want to briefly mention, because we're running out of time, that the duality, the experimentation, and the stigma, the haunting of the war, was present in cultural life as well. So experimentation and polarization. There's the sense that anything was possible that was very exhilarating but also very alienating. Many of these artists that I just have listed here were at their peak during this period. In art, and literature, and film, and architecture, music. Some of them we spoke about already, some of them we haven't. But the leaders were Kafka, Yeats, Joyce, Virginia Woolf, Mondrian, Klee, and Picasso. But this sort of cultural innovation was true in the Soviet Union. You read an important book by Zemyatin this week. So together with this creative expression, there was a theme of alienation, of loss, and anxiety about the future, despair, and retreat. And I'm going to sum that up on Thursday with a poem by William Butler Yeats that sort of depicts the image of the laboratory on a graveyard. And it shows that there were the ways that possibility or real innovations was possible, but also stymied due to the legacy of the war. And we'll also talk about, most of the lecture will be on Stalinism and the Soviet Union. So have a great week and see you on